Okay, students, so we're going to do a little mind map now on Frankenstein, the contextual features that are really important, the stuff that you need to know in order to apply and contextualize your discussion of Frankenstein when you're comparing it to Never Let Me Go. So I'm going to separate off the different types of context into different areas. So we're going to have sort of the context of sort of history here, so there's historical context over here. We're going to have a sort of genre context over here. And part of that sort of genre context, quite close to that, is this going to be this idea of the sort of literary context, which is going to be quite important as well. The literary context, literary influences. Over here, there's a big bit about sort of philosophical context, philosophical issues that are going around at the time that are really, really important. So we've got our history, our genre, our literary features, and the sort of philosophical issues that are going on at the time. And as well, I might as well just put on here at the same time sort of social or cultural sort of context close to the historical sort of attitudes, things along those lines, social and cultural context. So we'll start off with the history then. Some of the things that we might want to think about, of course, would be, it's going to come into the philosophical issue as well. There's this idea of romanticism, but it is actually a sort of a movement at the time, this idea of romanticism. So the idea of the Romantic poets, doing a little bit of revision on those, the types of things that they were interested in, the idea of nature, the idea of the political elements of Romanticism, this idea of wanting to have a more egalitarian or equal society, challenging the status quo, revolution, and things along those lines. Okay, so we've also got actually the French Revolution and revolutionary politics with it throughout the late 18th century. So both the American and the French revolutions in the late 18th century, they were essentially about a change to politics and trying to craft a more equal sort of secular society, really. Okay, so one of the things that we might also think about in terms of that sort of historical context and also the cultural one would be this idea of the sort of the politics of the time. So the politics of the Romantics might be important, revolutionary politics, that might be important, the types of political views that we might have, okay? And of course, attached to that, we might have this sort of biographical context as well. So in that idea of the biography and how that attaches to politics. So Shelley herself being very, very interested in romantic and revolutionary politics, as the Romantics were, and of course her parents being Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and William Godwin, who's another sort of great political thinker. So this idea of sort of her background being imbued with this sort of revolutionary, egalitarian sort of romantic politics, really. Okay. Very important in terms of the history, of course, is the idea of the Enlightenment. So we've got to be very, very subtle with this, the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is this process of scientific and rational understanding that occurred during the 17th and 18th centuries. And by the time we get to the beginning of the 19th, the end of the 18th century, the Enlightenment really has begun to explain the whole universe, so in a way that we understand today, the laws of physics and things that don't change, and an understanding and a movement towards sort of naturalism and an understanding of the natural world through the application of science and the scientific method. But one of the things, of course, that the Romantics were concerned with about the Enlightenment was that it somehow might distract us from things like emotion and feeling and relationships and the political nature of our existence, rather than just making everything quite cold. You'd be simply wrong if you said that Shelley didn't like the Enlightenment or the Romantics didn't like the Enlightenment. That many of them were very, very well clued up on the Enlightenment. But of course, they just had concerns about where it might lead. Okay? Now, one of the things in the Enlightenment that is directly relevant to Frankenstein is this idea of galvanism and the idea of bioelectricity, which is sort of discovered at the end of the 18th century, bioelectricity. So Galvani actually sort of experimented on both animals and criminals as well, dead criminals, and sort of gave them new life, sort of put electricity into these bodies, and it seemed like they could be reanimated, reanimated in that. And of course that led to questions about things like what we might call sort of abiogenesis, which is like the origins of life, these abiogenetic questions, questions of the origin of life, and then ultimately towards the end of the middle of the 19th century, questions of evolution as well in the natural world. So natural philosophy being a big sort of science within the Enlightenment, the study applying the scientific method to nature and trying to understand nature and where life came from. Another part of the Galvanism there would be this idea of body snatching too. So because of the newfound sort of desire for study of biology, that sort of previous religious prescriptions against ever studying human bodies, sort of dissecting human bodies, are sort of coming under stress, really. And so you do actually get, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, criminals sort of stealing bodies to be used in experiments and giving them to universities to make money and things along those lines. So body snatching is a thing in the 18th and 19th centuries that people are aware of, and it's met with certain amounts of horror, really. Okay, so understanding the idea of the political revolutions that are going on, the political elements of Romanticism, this desire for a more egalitarian society, links to Shelley's own biography, of course, her parents and her own interests being very much in revolutionary politics. The idea of the Enlightenment and this development of this idea of natural philosophy or biology, as we would call it, the scientific method, the concerns that might rob us somehow of something special, something precious, or distract us, and then Galvanism, of course, and actually there's a link there because Shelley herself studied and saw some sort of Galvani experiments. So these questions of bioelectricity and body snatching and things along those lines. Okay, onto the philosophical then. So we've done a little bit of Romanticism here, of course. One of the key influences on the Romantics would be, it's really hard to spell, would be Russo. So Russo's philosophy, a very, very important philosopher that Shelley and other Romantics had read. And this idea really that in a sort of the question of a state of nature. So for Rousseau, really, we're born in a state of nature, and sort of we're born without prejudice, but it's very, very quickly society's prejudices act on us. So a child abandoned in society, Rousseau would think, would end up with terrible prejudices, but as a child abandoned in the state of nature might sort of begin to become a more sort of naturally sort of beautiful being. Alongside that is this idea of John Locke, lots and lots of philosophy of John Locke in here, and also sort of like what a more modern version would be like David Hume, and this idea of the tabula rasa, more modern, 200 years ago, the tabula rasa, and this scientific idea that Locke first comes up with, that we're sort of like an empty cabinet or a blank slate when we're born. So essentially it's society that puts all of its prejudices onto us. All of our ideas come from experience, according to Locke, and sort of Hume as well, that ideas derive from experience, our minds derive from experience. Okay? Another philosophical idea, which is sort of beginning this idea, is sort of pantheism, or what we might call panentheism. At the very least, we'd say that there's a question of God. There's big questions about what God is, and that links to the Enlightenment understanding of the natural world. We're beginning to understand that the world sort of works in a particular way, doesn't really need supernatural intervention to work. It just does, according to very strict natural rules. And this changed the concept of God from an interventionist figure in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance into what we might call sort of or a deistic sort of God, or God as sort of nature in some way, the universe is. And panentheism is this idea that the universe has a will in some way. The universe has a will. So if we're saying that Victor sins against nature by creating this abomination, and that nature somehow gets his revenge on us, we're saying that there's a sort of panentheistic idea within the text that nature knows when it's being wronged, and that it does something. I mean, even a belief in karma in some way is panentheistic. The idea that the universe will know and will find some sort of balance. There's a sense in which the universe is conscious there. People who believe that are called panentheists. Okay, I know obviously it's not a movement at the time, but we're retrospectively calling it that. Okay, some other ideas tied to God then is, of course, this idea of the biblical allusion, the Bible, and a re-understanding the Bible. So the question of Genesis and, of course, Adam is a big question within the text. So the creature actually refers to himself as Adam, and by analogy, Frankenstein is God, and the creature is man. And of course, that makes a nice link to our next bit, which is this idea to the literary issues, which would be Paradise Lost. There's a literary influence, Milton's Paradise Lost. So Milton's Paradise Lost, sort of an epic poem which deals with the fall, and a big part of it is from Satan's perspective. So it does sort of paint Satan in a more interesting light, certainly the most interesting character in it. And some of the really big philosophical questions are, this discussion between Adam and God, this question of why did you make me, why are we here, and almost a sort of questioning attitude, and why have you made me sick and then commanded me to be well? It seems cruel in some sort of way. So these questions of origins, but again, this idea of sort of the questioning these previously held religious ideals and feeling okay about doing those through analogy. Okay, another literary influence would be the idea of sort of Greek myth, or Roman myth. The idea of Prometheus. It's subtitled The Modern Prometheus, so modern in the sense of all the science in it, but Prometheus, this person who sort of steals from the gods and fire from the gods and gives it to people, and in overreaching this idea of sort of ambition, it becomes a sort of tragic demise. And you sort of overreach and suffer a great tragic fall, really. There's a warning about ambition in there. And again, that would link to, this questioning of the Enlightenment over here. We want to understand how the universe works, but have we flown too close to the sun, to use the Icarus metaphor? Have we stolen some knowledge that we ought not to have in a modern context, obviously like nuclear weapons, or with our other texts, it's cloning and things like that, isn't it? Okay, so we've got Paradise Lost, and then of course the Romantic poetry. So especially the Ancient Mariner, things along those lines, other literary influences on the text. So there are, and of course it links to the biography, because Shelley is having affairs with at least one, just one, I should hasten to add, but with Shelley, and of course she's surrounded by all these other Romantic poetry, such as Coleridge and people along those lines. So she's really part of this culture. Okay, on genre then, let's just some look at the different issues there. Of course, we can link to the Gothic genre, which is again a form of Romanticism. Romantic literature, the Gothic genre, understanding those key features of the Gothic would be a big part of this. It's often been said that this is a sci-fi, the first sci-fi element. So everything sort of takes an imagined world, takes a not quite existing science, and imagines the sort of ethical problems that might occur. So here we have the sort of sci-fi elements of the genre coming through, the beginnings of that genre. And of course the other one would be the idea of sort of the revenge narrative, which is really big, the sort of revenge stories where either nature's getting revenge on Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's getting his revenge on the creature, or the creature's getting his revenge on Frankenstein. It sort of fills the narrative there. The other thing to say about that is, of course, there's elements of the epistolary genre in there too. So it forms letters, really. It's bookended by this frame narrative, or this sort of magic box sort of narrative that are framed with letters. So we've got sort of elements of realism alongside, help if I could spell, wouldn't it? Realism. Alongside elements of fantasy and science fiction, things along those lines. Okay, so I think that's pretty much us. We've got sort of historical issues, philosophical is very important, literary connections, genre connections, and through it all really is this understanding of Shelley being at the forefront and really, really involved with this cutting edge movement of Romanticism. Okay, thank you.